Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I'm John. Today I'm going to share with you how to create an sci-fi scene using Blender 3.6 geometry nodes. Alright, so let me walk you through what we are going to do in this video. First, we'll start by create the mountain using geometry nodes. Next, we'll add gradient color and star to the sky. Then we'll add nebula to the sky as well. After that, we'll add planet. Lastly, we'll include a small character to complete the scene. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So select the camera and the light and delete them for now. Select the cube. Rename it mountain. Go to geometry nodes tab. Add a new geometry nodes. Then let's add a grid. Connect it to group output. Let's delete the group input. We don't need it for now. Let's turn on the wireframe so that we can see the segment. Then let's make it bigger. Let's increase the vertices to 500 maybe. By the way, instead of straight away put a high amount of vertices here, I want to make it less vertices in the 3D viewport and more vertices in the final render later. So to do it, let's add an East viewport node. Then add a switch node. Set it to float. Connect the viewport node to switch. Connect the output to vertices X and Y. Then I want to set 70 vertices for the grid that show in the viewport. And I want to set 500 vertices for the grid that show in the final render. Zoom out to see the grid. When we zoom out, we can see part of the grid is disappear. The reason is because our grid is too big. So to fix this, in the 3D viewport, press N to toggle the side panel. Then go to View tab. Add the clip N here. Increase the value to 3000 maybe. Okay, now we solve it. Okay, now to shape the mountain, we'll need to move certain points upward. So to do that, we need a set position. Add a position node. Connect it to position. By doing this, we get the position of all the points on the grid. Then let's add a vector math node. Then add a noise texture. Connect the color to vector math node. Then we only want the point to move toward Z axis. So let's add a combine XYZ. Then let's set this to 4D. Then start to play around with this value. Then let's add a math node. Set it to multiply. Let's multiply 40 maybe. Okay, now we can see the texture. And now let's frame all these nodes. Name it noise displacements. Next, we need to choose the specific section of the grid that will form the mountain. So I'm going to use icosphere as a controller to choose the part I want. So to do that, we can either add an icosphere in the 3D viewport and bring it into the node editor, or we can add a sphere straight in the node editor. So in this video, I will straight away add it in the node editor. So let's add an icosphere. Then to see the sphere in the 3D viewport, let's hold Shift, Ctrl and right click and drag it to the node before the group output. Let's scale up the sphere to 100 meter maybe. We can add more subdivision as well. Then we need a geometry proximity to let the sphere to affect the position of the point. Then we also need to get the distance between the sphere and the position of all the points on the grid. Then add a position node. Connect it to distance. Then we need to add a map range here. Connect the distance to from max. Then we need to untick the clamp. And here Hold Shift, right click and drag to tie this up. Then add a transform node. We need to move up the sphere to see the result. The closer the sphere is to the grid, the higher the mountain will be. Scale it shorter. You can scale it to the shape you want. We can also add an RGB curve here to make it much more nicer. Then we can disconnect this for now. Let's frame two of this node. Name it mountain 1. Next, I want to add a few more mountain. So to do that, it's really simple. Just duplicate the mountain 1, rename it mountain 2. Then we need a join geometry. Connect them together. And now two of these mountains are overlapping together. Let's move this to left and move this to right. I want to make this mountain slightly taller. We can also scale this mountain wider. Let's add the third mountain by duplicate this, rename it mountain 3. Connect it to join geometry. Let's put this mountain at the center. Move it backward. Then I want it to be shorter. I think we can also add more segment to the mountain so that it looks nicer. So let's add a subdivision after the grid. Okay, now we have done the mountain. Next, we can start to add lighting, material and camera. So let's turn the render engine to cycles, device to GPU. Then let's add an area light. Turn off the wireframe. Then we need to move it higher. Scale it bigger. Turn on the render preview mode. Let's make it brighter. Increase it to 10 megawatts maybe. Let's put it behind the mountain. Slightly rotate it. I think we can scale the light slightly bigger to make the shadow softer. Okay, now we can start to add material for this mountain. So select the mountain, go to Material tab, rename this mountain. In the Geometry node, go to the Group Output, add a Set Material. Then select mountain, go to the Shader Editor, press Home button to see the node. Then later, we need to add displacement to the mountain shader. So before we do that, add a Material tab, go to Setting, and make sure we choose Displacement and Bump for the displacement method. Then in the Shader Editor, add a Voronoi texture. To visualize the node, we can hold Ctrl Shift and select the node. Then I want to change this to 4D. For this one, I want to use F2 and change this to Manhattan. And now I also want to use the object coordinate. So with the Voronoi texture selected, press Ctrl T. Delete the mapping. We don't need it for now. Then connect the object to vector. Let's scale down the texture to 1. Alright, so this texture here is going to be the base texture. But I do want to make this texture much more organic and random. And I want to add more noise and more detail. So now let's add the noise texture. Hold Shift Ctrl and select it to visualize it. Now I want to make the noise texture much more detail. So let's turn the scale to 4 maybe. And then I'm also going to turn the detail all the way up to the max, which is 15. Now I'm going to make the noise texture distort the placement of the Voronoi. So let's add a mix color node. Connect the noise texture to the mix color node. Then hold Shift Ctrl and select the Voronoi texture to see the result. I think we can change this to linear light. Let's put 0.1 for the factor. I also want to add this noise texture into the actual color. So let's add another mix color node. Connect the noise texture to the mix node. Let's put 0.3 for the factor. Connect this to base color. Connect this to surface. I want this texture to affect the roughness as well. I think we don't need it for the base color. Now the effect is not obvious enough. Let's add a color ramp to improve it. And I also want the texture to affect the bump and displacement. Let's add a bump node. Connect it to normal. Then I also want to use the texture for displacement. Connect it to displacement. It might not appear to be very detailed in the viewport, but when you do the final render, it will be a lot better. For the base color, I think we can make it darker. Next, we can start to add sky color with a star. So to do it, switch this from object to Ver. Add a color ramp. Add a gradient texture. Select the gradient texture and press Ctrl T. Then we only want the gradient to go Z-axis direction. So before we go ahead to adjust the gradient color, let's add a camera. Then in the 3D viewport, press numpad 0 to see the camera view. Go to camera properties tab, change the focal length to 30, make it wide angle. Let's increase the clip end to 10,000 maybe. Then I want this artwork to be rendered in a portrait view. So let's go to output properties tab. Okay, now we can start to put color for the sky. Let's decrease the light size to 2.5 maybe to make the shadow harder, and increase the power to 30 megawatts. Okay, next we can start to add the star on the sky. So before we do anything, let's group all this node. Name it sky gradient. Then we need to add an edge shader. Duplicate all this node. Rename it star. Then connect it to edge shader. Let's reset all this value back to default. We can delete two of this node. We don't need it anymore. Add a Voronoi texture. Connect the distance to color ramp. Now we need to make the edge of all these dots sharper and we need to make it smaller. So let's turn this to white color. Make it really small. And now if we zoom in, we can't see anything. So let's try to increase the texture scale higher. Okay, now we can see the star. Okay, now I want to add this nebula. So let's turn off the render preview. Add a cube. Rename it Nebula. Scale it bigger. Put it slightly behind the mountain. Turn on the render preview again. In the shader editor, let's switch this back to object. Add a new material. Name it Nebula. Then in the 3D viewport, press numpad 0 to back to the camera view. Press home button to see the node. Delete this principal node. Then add a principal volume instead. Connect it to the volume. Then we need a gradient texture. Change this to spherical. Then select the gradient texture and press Ctrl T. Connect the object to vector. Change the mapping tab to texture. Then let's frame this node and name it base shape. Then we need a noise texture and a color ramp to be able to control it. Then we need a math node with multiply so that we can control the strength. Then I'm going to duplicate this math node and I'm going to subtract it from our base. And now we can see the edge of the nebula is kind of too simple. So let's try to increase the detail and the roughness here. And then we can try to increase the strength as well. So let's try to multiply 3 maybe. It is disappear. So let's play around with the color ramp. Okay, now let's frame 3 of this node. Name it Nebula Edge. Then let's duplicate 3 of this node. Rename it Nebula Texture. Then duplicate 2 of this node. Connect this mapping to the noise texture. And now I want to combine 2 of these nodes together. So let's duplicate this math node again. Set it to multiply. Connect the nebula texture to the multiply. Back to the nebula texture. Again, let's try to play with this color ramp to get what we want. Messing around with this noise texture as well. Let's add another noise texture here. Press Alternate P to unframe it. Connect the factor to the vector instead of color. Play around with this value again. Then I also want to add color to the nebula as well. Currently it looks like cloud. So to do that, let's select this multiply and hold Shift D to duplicate it. Connect the subtract to multiply. Then to add a color, we need a color ramp. Connect the color ramp to the base color. Then try to add the color you want. Then try to multiply 1 maybe. Let's add a divide here so that we can control the density. Divide 200 maybe. You don't have to follow me. You can put any value you want to get a different result. I want to add a hue and saturation. Put 1.2 for the saturation maybe. Increase the value to 2. I think we can lower the value of the divide here so that it looks obvious. Okay, next we can start to create this planet. So let's add a sphere. Rename it planet. Make it bigger. Put it behind the mountain. Right click and set stretch move. Add a new material. Name it planet. Then add a Musgrave texture. Connect the height to the base color. Set the roughness to 1. We don't want to have reflection. Set this to rigid multifractal. Decrease the dimension to 0.3 maybe. Increase this to 51 maybe. So now we get the rocky crack texture. Then press Ctrl T to bring in the mapping texture. Now we need to distort the texture to make it look more realistic. So duplicate this Musgrave texture. Press Ctrl T again. Add a mix color node. Then we can connect the height to the mix color node. I'm going to scale down the texture to around 0.8 maybe. So now we have a large detail and small detail. Then we can add the color ramp so that we can add some color onto it. You can put any color you want. And now I want to add a layer of atmosphere to the planet. So to do it, let's add a mix color node. I'm going to switch this to add. You can add the atmosphere color you want. Add the color B here, but I'm going to leave it like this. Then add a layer width. Then we need a math node. Set it to divide. Divide 2 and plug it into the factor. Then we can add a color ramp to further control it. To make it look better, I think we can also connect this color ramp to the emission. Then next, I want to add this small character to the scene. So I have already included download link in the description below. Please check it and follow along the video. Import it into the Blender. Turn off the render preview for now. Turn on the wireframe. So now we can see this model is really high poly and we don't need it to be so detailed. So let's try to reduce the polygon. Let's decrease the ratio to 0.05. Okay, now it's a lot better. Let's apply the modifier. Let's scale this smaller. Press numpad 7 to see the top view. Hide the nebula for now. Move the character to somewhere here. Let's rotate it a little bit. Press numpad 0 again to see the camera view. Turn off the wireframe. Turn on the render preview. And now we can add a material for it. Let's simply add an orange color for it. Turn on the nebula again. And now we done it. So if you like my video, please subscribe and see you in the next video. Bye.